In Canada, there's a terrible history of our native people being horribly abused by the state. Their children were abducted for 100 years and sent to terrible residential schools where they were sexually, emotionally, and physically abused, and many of them died at the hands of the church and the state. It so happens that our Indigenous Canadians also make up a large percentage of our prison population. They have much higher rates of addiction, suicide, mental health issues, physical illnesses that they never used to have before colonization. And unfortunately, and whereas they used to parent in a much healthier way than so-called advanced societies parent, they really knew how to parent. Hold kids, support them, give them an environment that reared them to be confident, self-assured, socially connected human beings. They knew how to do it. They were much closer to our nature. That's been largely extirpated. As a result, now they abuse their kids. So each generation then passes on its trauma to the next. So in a lot of Native communities, it's almost impossible to find young girls by the time they're teenagers who had not been sexually abused. Now that's the impact of the past, but it's being exerted in this particular lifetime. Then you have what's called epigenetic transmission, which means that the way the genes function, if one generation is traumatized, that alters not the gene structure, but the genetic functioning. And that genetic functioning can be passed on to future generations. That's a new science. I don't think we fully know yet how strong those epigenetic effects are. It's an emerging field. It's been some very interesting research. But in general, and certainly it's already true that when a mother carries an infant, the stresses and traumas that she is burdened with can affect the developing brain and personality of the child already in the womb already. So yes, the experience, and as a Jew, I can tell you that the traumas of previous generations certainly have an impact on, as a part Palestinian, you know the same thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's been an unfortunate set of circumstances that have, in my view, imposed the trauma of one people onto another people.
We're here today.
Yeah.
in loving embrace.
Yeah. So the past trauma does happen, and Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, talks about the pain body, which is really our accumulated traumas that affect us. And he talks about the pain body can exist on a social and historical level as well.
Yeah.
So women, because of the persecution of women, the witch hunts, the oppression of women, the rape, and so on, women carry that pain body, and certain peoples carry a heavier pain body than other peoples. So yeah, it's all multi-generational, it's all historical, and I think that the effects are always exerted in this particular lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the middle part of the book, you give so many examples of how the trauma that we store within us lead to the manifestations of illness. For example, racism leading to asthma, or even within culturally, how African Americans deal with hypertension more frequently, and how sometimes we just look at the diagnosis of whatever the disease is and think that that's it. But like, there's all these psychosomatic, emotional elements that we just are not aware of, that are often the real reason for why we have the manifestation of a disease or a diagnosis. So is there anything you want to speak to there? Because I thought it was so fascinating, and all the examples from gender to race to the different things that we hold within us that create the illness.
Sure. So this is where my profession, the medical profession, is so remiss in its duties, because we have the science now. I mean, we have the science elegantly delineated, showing the unity of mind and body, showing how emotions affect physiology, which also means that our relationships affect physiology, because our relationships program our emotions. So when there's a study that shows that parents are very stressed, their kids are more likely to have asthma, it's because the stresses of the parents affect the physiology of the child. That's been known for decades. It's not even controversial. And yet, You go to the average physician with asthma, they'll never talk to you about stress. They'll just give you inhalers, which is necessary but not sufficient to deal with the issue. Same way, there's been a study that showed that the more experiences of racism a Black American woman has to endure, the greater a risk for asthma. Now, the physiology is very simple. I'm not going to go into it here, but it's very simple. It's very straightforward, not even controversial. And how do we treat asthma, by the way? You know how we treat it? We give people stress hormones. We give adrenaline and cortisol in the form of injections or inhalers. Should we maybe ask ourselves, gosh, we're treating it with stress hormones? Does stress have something to do with it, maybe? As a matter of fact, if one asks oneself, which medications are used most commonly across the board? If you come in with inflammation of the intestines, as in colitis, or the joints, as in rheumatoid arthritis, or the skin, as in eczema or psoriasis, or the nervous system, as in multiple sclerosis, or the lungs, what do we give people? We give people steroids. What are steroids? They're the stress hormones that are adrenal gland manufacturers. Maybe we should see that there's a connection between stress and all these conditions, and there is. So, great pioneers of medicine, who I won't name now, but they're in the book, in the 19th century already identified that multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and breast cancer were related to stress. They had no science then. They were just giants of medicine with tremendous insight. Since then, there's been 100 years of research showing the relationship between, say, stress, trauma, and rheumatoid arthritis. And there's women, by the way, who develop 70 or 80% of autoimmune diseases. Nobody understands why. Well, they just happen to be the stress absorbers of their whole families and of their men as well. That's why they have more stress-related conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis, much more. It's also simple, it's also straightforward, and it's also scientific. To go back to Black Americans and hypertension, they have a higher risk, Black American men have a higher risk of high blood pressure, hypertension it's called. Their genetic relatives in Africa don't. It's not genetic. So what is it? Well, let's do a simple linguistic exercise. Take the word hypertension and split it. Hypertension, hypertension. Oh, too much tension. Black American kids already have higher blood pressure than white kids. And why? Because of the stress of racism. And just to conclude this, a wonderful American physician called George Engel, back in 1972, called for what he termed a biopsychosocial view of medicine, which is to recognize that our biology is inseparable from our psychology, which is inseparable from our social relationships. We are biopsychosocial creatures. And all those influences determine our health or our illness.